Today's episode of the Qin Empire is about a long-standing historical misconception in China. The claim that King Ping of Zhou granted the entire Guanzhong region to the Qin people. In reality, he only gave them a much smaller area called Qifeng. Let's clarify two key terms, Guanzhong and Qifeng. Guanzhong generally refers to the vast land west of Hangu Pass, whereas Qifeng specifically refers to Fengcheng in the Qishan region. Later, the Qin state took over Guanzhong and justified it by claiming it had been granted by King Ping. But King Ping himself would have known whether he had actually made such a promise. However, at that time, he was too weak to return to Haojing. And Qin's control over Guanzhong happened to align with his interests, so he simply chose to accept it. According to Qin records, Duke Xiang of Qin escorted King Ping to the east, to the state of Zheng. During this journey, King Ping allegedly took Duke Xiang's hand and expressed his hopes for Qin, saying something along the lines of, "Whoever drives out the Quanrong, barbarians shall have Guanzhong." Later, the Qin people fought for Guanzhong themselves and took this statement as a royal decree. However, if we look at other historical sources, we find that King Ping did indeed reward Duke Xiang of Qin, but not with all of Guanzhong, only with Qifeng. He acknowledged Duke Xiang's contribution in escorting him to safety, and as a reward, formally granted him the status of a feudal lord with Qifeng as his fief. So where exactly is Qifeng? Qishan is the ancestral homeland of the Zhou dynasty, while Feng refers to Fengjing, an important city in that area. The total area of Qifeng was quite small, only about 10 square li, roughly 5 square kilometers. King Ping's true intention was to give the Qin people an official title and position them at the doorstep of the royal court, essentially making them the gatekeepers. At the time, Qishan was no longer under Zhou control. It was occupied by the Shirong tribes. This situation was akin to someone granting you the kingdom of Mars, while having no actual authority over Mars. Whether the Qin people could take control of Qishan was entirely up to their own efforts. But here's where things get interesting. Qin. Historians later reinterpreted the grant. They altered Qifeng to Qifeng, changing the meaning from Fengcheng in Qishan to the entire area from Qishan to the Feng River. By doing so, they expanded their supposed territory to include all of Guanzhong. This is an obvious distortion. Historically, Zhou kings never granted entire regions to feudal lords. Typically, a fief consisted of a single central settlement, with a surrounding area of 5 to 10 li, depending on the noble's rank. There was no precedent for a feudal lord being granted an entire province, let alone a massive region like Guanzhong. In short, the Qin people took what was meant to be a small land grant and exaggerated it into a claim over an entire strategic region. It was as if King Ping had given them a small village, and they turned around and claimed an entire kingdom. In reality, Qifeng had nothing to do with Guanzhong. Guanzhong was the heart of Zhou's domain, located east of San Pass, while Qishan had been under Shirong control since the reign of King Yi of Zhou. Qifeng, situated in what is now Gansu province, lay west of San Pass and was beyond Zhou's direct rule. The truth is that King Ping granting Qin the title of feudal lord was a mere formality. The Qin people were already fighting guerrilla wars in the Qishan region, so King Ping simply legitimized their presence there. This didn't mean he was ceding an entire territory to them. He was just acknowledging their existence as an official vassal state. Despite this clear discrepancy, Qin's version of the story became widely accepted over time. Why wasn't this mistake corrected? The answer lies in the political turmoil of the time. The Zhou dynasty had entered an era of internal strife, known as the Two Kings period, where rival factions vied for power. In such a chaotic environment, no one had the authority or incentive to dispute Qin's version of history. The Zhou dynasty was fundamentally different from both the dynasties that preceded and followed it. Unlike later centralized empires, Zhou was essentially one of many competing states. It rose to dominance not through direct rule, but through a feudal system that relied on alliances among aristocratic clans, particularly those of the Ji surname, because Zhou's authority was built on a delicate balance of noble alliances. No one was in a position to challenge Qin's reinterpretation of history. Over time, their version of events became accepted as fact. The Zhou king wasn't an emperor like in later dynasties. Instead, he was the head of an alliance. Think of Zhou as a corporation with shared ownership, where the Zhou king was the biggest shareholder, so he got to be the chairman of the board. Now, why was he the biggest shareholder? Simple. Zhou was the strongest among all the states. But here's the key difference. Later Chinese emperors ran the country as their personal property, like a privately owned company. Zhou, on the other hand, was more like a federal system, where the king ruled by consensus, not absolute power. But don't get it wrong. Zhou wasn't just a title. It was a real kingdom with its own land and resources. Its power was rooted in one of the most valuable territories of ancient China, the Guanzhong Plain. This was prime real estate, fertile farmland, naturally fortified by mountains on all sides. It was one of the hardest places to conquer in history. Even during World War II, the Japanese army struggled to take control of this region. That's how strategically important it was. We often think of ancient kings as absolute rulers, but the Zhou king was different. He wasn't the ruler of the world. He was the leader of the world. What's the difference? Think of a top athlete. No matter how dominant they are, they can't stay on top forever. Someone younger, faster, and stronger will always come along. If you play the game, eventually, you lose. But Zhou's genius move was this. Instead of competing as a player, he became the referee. It all started with King Wu of Zhou. Instead of staying in the middle of the action, he positioned himself outside of it, overseeing the entire system. He divided up the land, gave power to the local lords, and established a network of loyalty and mutual benefit. Here's how it worked. Local rulers, the feudal lords, had their titles because of the Zhou king. As long as the Zhou king was respected, their own legitimacy was secure. If the Zhou king lost his status, these lords would just be random warlords with fancy titles. So they had a strong incentive to keep him on the throne. This was how the Western Zhou dynasty maintained stability. But everything changed in the Eastern Zhou period. Losing the homeland, Zhou kings become homeless rulers. When King Ping of Zhou moved the capital to Luoyang, things took a turn for the worse. Meanwhile, another Zhou king, King Xi, was stuck in Sanmenxia, barely holding on. At this point, the Zhou kings had lost their homeland in Guanzhong. They were now leaders without a kingdom, relying entirely on their allies for survival. King Ping depended on the state of Zheng. King Xi depended on the state of Guo. But here's the thing. Neither Zheng nor Guo wanted Zhou to return to Guanzhong. Why? Because even without land, the Zhou king still held political power. He was still the symbolic head of the system. If he had his own stronghold again, he wouldn't need them anymore. So they made sure he remained a king without a country. Meanwhile, another major player entered the game, the Qin state. At this point, King Ping had only one hope: his grandfather, Duke Shen Hao. He desperately wanted Shen to take control of Guanzhong so that he could return home. But there was a problem. Shen was the one who had killed King Ping's father. King Ping was already suspected of usurping the throne. If he publicly supported the man who murdered his father, it would ruin his reputation. So he had to pretend to cut ties with his grandfather while secretly hoping he would succeed. Then, out of nowhere, Qin stepped in. At that time, Qin was still a small and relatively weak state. So when they declared, "The Zhou king said we can take Guanzhong," King Ping just went along with it. Did he actually say that? Probably not, but he didn't deny it either. And why should he? Zhenning wasn't objecting. Guo wasn't objecting. Even the Zhou king himself didn't object. So Qin's misinterpretation of the royal decree became reality. The silent agreement. Why nobody spoke up? The state of Guo could have stepped in and said, "No, this is fake." But they didn't. Why? Because their biggest fear wasn't Qin. It was Zheng and Shen teaming up. If that happened, Guo would be caught in the middle and crushed. For them, letting Qin and Shen fight over Guanzhong was actually a good thing. The more those two battled, the safer Guo was. So they simply let history take its course. And that's how one of the biggest mistakes in Chinese history happened. Qin had misread the royal decree, or at least that's the story they told. Somehow, every major scholar, official, and ruler went along with it. For 3,000 years, this typo remained in history books. Even in the entire Eastern Zhou period, no one ever dared to correct it. Because let's be honest, when everyone pretends they agreed from the start, no one wants to admit they were silent when it happened. And that, my friends, is how history can be rewritten right before everyone's eyes. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next episode.